Blessings to you, beautiful soul. The angels wrap their wings around you right now, right in this very moment, wherever you are sitting, standing, or lying down as you receive these words. You are seen. You are loved. You are protected. Welcome to Angel's message for you. A sacred space created just for you. A place where heaven speaks to the heart, and the heart finally gets to hear the truth it has been longing for. Before you scroll away, before your mind tells you that you already know what this is going to say, I need you to stay with me. I need you to give yourself the gift of these next few minutes. Because what I am about to share with you is something your heart has been quietly waiting to hear for a long, long time. This message did not find you by accident. You were guided here. Something far greater than coincidence brought your eyes to these words today. And by the time you reach the very end, you are going to understand exactly why. So take a breath. A slow, deep, real breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension in your chest loosen just a little. Open your heart and allow the angels to speak directly to you right now. Dear one, your soulmate is no longer the same person they used to be. And I say this not to bring you sadness or confusion. I say this because it is one of the most beautiful and powerful truths the angels have ever shown me to share. Yes, in a very real sense, you have lost your soulmate. But not the way the word lost usually feels in the chest, cold and heavy and final. What you have lost is the old version of this person. The version who carried fear without knowing how to name it. The version who carried doubt without knowing how to heal it. The version who carried invisible wounds that bled quietly into every moment of connection between you. The version who listened to the wrong voices, voices from outside, voices from the past, voices that had no business weighing in on something as sacred as what exists between the two of you. And let those voices dim a love that was always meant to shine so brilliantly it would light up both of your lives. That person is gone now. And what has taken their place is someone entirely new. Someone stronger. Someone softer in the right places and firmer in the ones that matter. Someone more whole. Someone who wakes up every single morning thinking of you and choosing, consciously, deliberately, and with a full and open heart, to become the best version of themselves so that they can truly, completely, without reservation, be with you. Not halfway, not with one foot still stuck in the patterns of the past, but completely, fully, beautifully, and bravely present in the love they carry for you. And here is the thing, the one thing I most want you to hold on to long after this message has ended. Your soulmate changed because of you. Every single step they have taken on this extraordinary journey of transformation, every healthy choice they made when the easier path was right there in front of them, every quiet night of reflection instead of distraction, every moment of bravely letting go of what no longer served them, all of it, every last bit of it, was fueled by the love they carry for you deep in their heart. You were the reason. You were the why. When they did not have enough reasons to keep going for themselves, you were the one their mind went to. You were the face they pictured when they needed to remember why the work was worth it. Let that land. Take a moment. Let that really, truly land somewhere deep inside you. You are the reason someone decided to become better. You are the silent inspiration behind the total rebirth of another soul. You are the North Star someone has been navigating by through some of the darkest and most disorienting seasons of their internal life. That is not a small thing. That is not ordinary. That is one of the most profound and powerful expressions of love that exists in this world, to be the reason someone chose to rise. Now let me take you deeper into what the angels want you to understand about this transformation. Because there is so very much they want you to know. They want you to understand not just the beautiful outcome, but the full story, the hard parts, the painful parts, the parts that explain why things unfolded the way they did. Because when you understand the full story, something shifts inside you. The confusion starts to clear. The hurt starts to make sense. And the hope, that quiet, persistent, unshakable hope, gets a reason to grow even stronger. The version of your soulmate that you have lost used to live inside a constant inner battle. A war that never showed its full face on the outside but raged continuously on the inside. One part of them, the truest, most loving part, wanted so badly to believe in this love, in the strength and the rightness of what you two share. This part knew. It has always known. It felt the connection between you like something ancient and real and undeniable. But another part, the part shaped by old wounds and old fears and the accumulated weight of all the times they had been let down or made to feel like they weren't enough, that part was terrified. Afraid of not being enough for someone as wonderful as you. Afraid of getting hurt in the deep and irreversible way that only comes when you have loved someone fully and lost them. Afraid that, in the end, after all the effort and all the devotion and all the pieces of themselves they would lay down, something would still go wrong. And that fear was loud. Louder than the love on many days. So loud that it sometimes drowned out the very thing it was afraid to lose. This person allowed outside voices to have far too much power over what happened inside them. This is something the angels want you to understand deeply, because it explains so much. When someone around your soulmate said something negative about love in general, about the future, about your connection specifically, about whether you were the right person or whether the timing was right or whether this was all going to end in pain, those words did not just pass through. They did not bounce off the way they should have from someone with a firmly rooted sense of their own worth. They settled in. They found the cracks that doubt had already opened, and they dug roots into those cracks. They grew into fully formed fears. And slowly, quietly, almost without being noticed, those fears began to build walls. Invisible walls between your soulmate and the love they felt for you. Invisible walls between you and the closeness that was always meant to exist between you. There were days, and this is important for you to hear, when your soulmate looked at what you two had together and genuinely, painfully wondered whether it was worth continuing. Not because the love was not real. It was real. It was so real it was sometimes overwhelming. But because carrying that love while also carrying so much internal pain, so much confusion, so much unexpressed fear, it was exhausting in a way that no one on the outside could see. They gave to everyone around them, placing their own needs at the very bottom of every list, believing somewhere inside that this was what love required, that putting yourself last was a sign of how deeply you cared. But that kind of giving, constant, boundless, unreplenished, leads to a depletion of spirit that no amount of willpower can fight. A tired heart cannot hold great dreams. And your soulmate was tired, soul tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that sleep does not fix. They also struggled deeply with their sense of their own worth. The criticism and careless comments from people around them, people who sometimes meant well and sometimes did not, people who spoke without thinking about the weight their words would carry. These things did not simply pass through one ear and out the other. They were absorbed. Slowly, steadily, without full awareness, your soulmate absorbed those things and turned them into beliefs. They began to wonder whether they truly deserved something as beautiful and deep and real as what they felt for you. Because when you have been told in so many small and large ways that you are not quite enough, not quite successful enough, not quite healed enough, not quite ready enough, you start to build a case against yourself. And when you doubt your own worth, you begin to sabotage without meaning to. You hold back. You create distance. You find reasons why things won't work before they have even had a proper chance. Not to hurt the other person, but to protect yourself from a pain that your mind has already decided is inevitable. Dear one, none of this happened because of weakness. I want to be so clear about that because the angels are very clear about it. None of it happened because your soulmate loved you any less. It happened because this person had not yet learned, truly learned, in the bones and the gut and the soul to fully believe in themselves. They had not yet found the courage or the tools or the stillness needed to look at themselves honestly, with compassion and say, I am enough exactly as I am. I am worthy of this love. I am capable of sustaining something this deep and this real. That lesson, the lesson of genuine, non-performative self-belief, takes time for most people. Takes pain. Takes hitting a wall that you cannot ignore. Takes a turning point. And that turning point came for your soulmate. I promise you it came. There was a moment, quiet on the outside, almost invisible to anyone watching, but absolutely enormous on the inside, when your soulmate reached a place where the pain of staying exactly the same became greater than the fear of changing everything. Something shifted. Something cracked open in the most necessary and beautiful way. It was like a door that had been locked for years. A door behind which lived a better, freer, truer version of this person. Suddenly, finally swung open. And the light that came through was blinding at first. But it was real. And it was warm. And it was exactly what had been needed all along. This person stood at that internal crossroads and made a decision. Not a small one. Not a comfortable one. A real one. The kind that rearranges who you are at the level of identity and not just behavior. They decided to stop waiting. Stop waiting for the circumstances to change, for others to validate them, for the perfect moment when everything would feel safe enough to begin. They decided instead to do the inner work. The actual, honest, unglamorous, day-by-day inner work of becoming whole. They began to understand that love, real love, lasting love, love that builds instead of erodes, is not simply a feeling that happens to you. It is something you have to be capable of holding. And to be capable of holding a love this strong, this real, this deep, you first have to be a person who is at peace with yourself. Not perfect, just at peace. So they began. Slowly at first, with the hesitance of someone who is not yet sure this new path is real. But then with growing certainty, with growing commitment, with growing joy, they started caring for their physical body in ways they had long neglected, nourishing it with intention, resting it without guilt, moving it in ways that brought energy instead of just burning it away. Not out of vanity, the angels are very clear about this, but out of genuine respect and gratitude for the vessel that carries their soul through this life. They began to understand, in a way that was more than intellectual, that they cannot pour from an empty cup. That to love someone well, to truly show up for another person with presence and patience and warmth, you first have to have something inside you to give. And so they began building that something. Every healthy meal was a small act of self-respect. Every night of real rest was a small act of faith in the future. Every moment of intentional physical care was a silent declaration that they were worth investing in. That their life and the love waiting inside it was worth showing up for. They worked on their mind with just as much intention, just as much care. The anxiety that used to fill the quiet moments, the racing thoughts, the what-ifs, the replaying of old mistakes, the rehearsing of conversations that had already happened and could not be undone, began to loosen its grip as your soulmate became more deliberate about what they allowed into their mental space. They became selective, more protective of their own peace. They began stepping back from the noise, from the people and conversations and content that fed insecurity and comparison and fear, and moving toward things that genuinely built them up. Learning, reflection, stillness, gratitude, prayer. honest conversations with themselves about what was true and what was just the voice of old fear trying to masquerade as wisdom. Every healthy thought became a brick in the foundation of the new life they were carefully and lovingly constructing. This mental transformation was not easy, and the angels want you to know that. It required your soulmate to sit with discomfort again and again, to feel the pull of old habits, the habit of catastrophizing, the habit of assuming the worst, the habit of listening to the harshest internal critic, and to consciously choose something different. To say, not once but hundreds of times, that thought is not the truth. I am going to choose a different one, over and over and over. And what happens when you make that choice hundreds of times is that the old pathway in the mind begins to weaken, and the new pathway begins to strengthen. And what was once a daily battle begins to feel, slowly, more like a daily practice. Something maintainable, something sustainable, something that begins to feel less like fighting yourself and more like taking care of yourself. Your soulmate also did something that took real bravery. They began to look honestly at the relationships in their life, not with judgment or harshness, but with clear and loving eyes. They began to notice which relationships left them feeling lighter and which ones left them feeling heavier, which conversations built them up and which ones chipped away at the sense of peace they were working so hard to grow. And slowly, because these things are never done in a single bold gesture but in a series of small and steady ones, they began to shift, spending less time in the spaces that drained them, spending more time in the spaces that nourished, protecting their energy not selfishly but wisely, understanding that the energy they were learning to protect was not just for themselves. It was for you. It was for the love they were preparing to fully live. And spiritually, this is where something truly remarkable happened. Something opened in your soulmate on a level that goes beyond habit or discipline or willpower. They began to seek a connection that they had perhaps never allowed themselves to fully seek before. A connection with something greater, with the universe, with the divine, with the deep, still, knowing place inside themselves where truth lives undistorted by fear or opinion. They found that when they quieted the endless noise of the outside world, even for just a few minutes each day, they could hear something steady, something true, a voice or maybe just a feeling that said, "You are loved, you are guided, you are not alone in this. Keep going." That spiritual awakening, that quiet opening to something greater than the ordinary self, changed everything. The fear of not being capable of love, not being worthy of love, not being able to sustain love, it began to dissolve. Not all at once. Healing rarely works all at once. But steadily, the way dawn comes, first barely visible, then undeniable. The old insecurities that had felt so permanent, so woven into who this person was, began to transform. And this is the thing about real transformation, it does not just make you better. It makes you grateful for the pain that preceded it. Because your soulmate began to understand that every wound they had ever carried, every doubt, every fear, every dark night of the soul, all of it had been preparation. All of it had been shaping them into someone capable of receiving and giving a love this real. Every wound that had once been a reason to give up became a reason to keep growing. Every doubt that had once felt like an enemy became, in hindsight, a signpost pointing toward what needed attention, what needed healing, what needed to be let go of before the next chapter could begin. Every hard season became evidence not of failure but of resilience. And as the evidence of their own resilience accumulated, your soulmate began to stand a little differently, to walk a little differently, to look at the future and at you with new eyes. Your soulmate looked at the love they felt for you and stopped seeing it as something fragile that needed to be protected by keeping distance and staying guarded. They started seeing it, truly seeing it, as something sacred, something worth honoring, something worth showing up for, fully and without holding back. They made a quiet vow, the kind that is made in the heart rather than out loud, to be the kind of person this love deserves. To earn it. Not in the transactional sense, love is never a transaction, but in the sense of becoming the most genuine, healthy, whole version of themselves they could possibly be. Dear one, I want you to really feel the significance of what is happening here. Take a moment with it. This is not just a story about someone deciding to go to the gym or eat better or read more books. This is a story about a soul making the deep and deliberate choice to come home to itself and to you. This is about someone choosing love. Not just the feeling of love, which comes and goes with circumstances, but the practice of love, the discipline of love, the daily, ordinary, unglamorous, beautiful discipline of choosing to become someone worthy of what they feel. Choosing to do the hard thing, the honest thing, the humbling, sometimes painful thing, because the love they carry for you is worth every bit of it. Every morning your soulmate opens their eyes. You are there in their heart, not as a weight or a pressure or a source of anxiety, but as a source of meaning, as a compass. In the way that a compass always points north regardless of where you carry it, regardless of what surrounds it, you are their north. The direction that all of their becoming is aimed toward. The reason the discipline makes sense. The reason the days of effort feel purposeful rather than pointless. The reason the sacrifices do not feel like sacrifices at all, but like investments in the only future they truly want. And what has emerged, what is still emerging, from this entire extraordinary process is a version of your soulmate that is genuinely, profoundly different from the person who was there before. Not unrecognizable in the physical sense, but different where it matters most. Different in the depth behind their eyes. Different in the quality of their presence. Different in the steadiness of their choices and the groundedness of their intentions. Different in the way they carry themselves, with a quiet, earned confidence that is not arrogance but simply the natural result of having faced yourself honestly and chosen, again and again, to do better. The old version doubted whether this love was truly worth everything it was asking for. The new version has made peace with that question. There is no more doubt. There is only the certainty of someone who has chosen their direction and walked far enough down the path to know they are not turning back. The old version was shaken and swayed by the opinions of others, by careless comments and unsolicited advice and the judgments of people who did not understand the depth of what existed between you. The new version has learned, through real experience and real pain, to guard their heart like something precious. To choose wisely and deliberately whose voice gets to live inside their head. To understand that the only opinions that truly matter are the ones that come from a place of genuine love and real understanding. The old version was depleted and running on empty, giving endlessly without replenishing, loving outwardly without loving inwardly. The new version has built, is still building, a life that refills the well. A life with practices and boundaries and habits that ensure there is always something real and beautiful and wholehearted to give. The old version was afraid. Deeply, quietly, persistently afraid. The new version is ready. Not fearless. Readiness is not the same as the absence of fear, but ready in the sense of having made peace with the fear, of having looked it in the eye, named it, understood where it came from, and decided that it would no longer be the one making the decisions. Ready in the sense of knowing that whatever comes, they now have the tools to face it. That whatever challenges arise, and they will because that is the nature of life and love, they are no longer facing them alone. inside themselves in the dark. They are facing them as someone who has learned their own strength. And here is what the angels most want you to hear right now. In this moment, this transformation was not just for your soulmate. It was for both of you, for your story, for the love that was always meant to exist between you in its fullest and most beautiful form. A form that could not have existed earlier because neither of you, not just your soulmate, but both of you, was fully ready to hold it yet. The universe is not cruel. It is not randomly placing obstacles in the path of love. It is allowing time for the people involved to grow into the love they are meant to share. And that is what has been happening. A growing, a becoming, preparation. Every wound that was healed in your soulmate created more space for love to live inside them. Every old habit that was released made room for new and healthier and more joyful ways of connecting. Every moment of honest self-reflection and courageous growth became a gift, not just for themselves, but for you, for the relationship, for the shared future that is even now being quietly written, word by invisible word, in the language of choices and growth and love that keeps choosing itself. The angels see that future. They do not just hope for it, they see it. They see it with the clarity that only comes from a perspective that is not limited by time or fear or doubt. And they are full of joy when they look at it. They want you to know. They want you to really know in a way that settles in your chest and stays there. That what is coming between you and your soulmate is not the fragile, uncertain, fear-filled love that struggled before. What is coming is something that has been earned. Something that has been tested and strengthened and purified by everything it has been through. A love that has been chosen, actively, repeatedly, even when it was hard and uncertain and would have been easier to give up. A love that has been prepared for on a soul level. You lost the old version, and in losing it, you gained something so much greater. You gained a partner who knows their own worth, who has sat with themselves long enough and honestly enough to understand what they carry and what they are capable of, who has done the inner work, the real, messy, unglamorous inner work, and who continues to do it because they understand that growth is not a destination but a direction, a way of moving through life. You gain someone with genuine emotional maturity, the kind that is not performed but lived. The kind that means they can handle the hard days without dissolving, hold the heavy feelings without being overwhelmed, and show up for both themselves and for you even when showing up is not easy. You gain someone with spiritual depth, a connection to something greater that anchors them when the storms of life try to sweep them off course. Someone with the self-awareness to recognize their own patterns, name them with honesty, and the courage to interrupt them even when interrupting them is uncomfortable. That is extraordinary. That is genuinely, truly rare. And it is yours. Dear one, I want to speak to you now about your own journey in all of this. Because this message is not only about your soulmate, it is about you too. And the angels want you to know that while your soulmate has been going through their remarkable transformation, you have not been standing still. You have been growing too, perhaps more than you have given yourself credit for. You have been learning, sometimes through joy and sometimes through real difficulty, what you need, what you deserve, what love actually looks and feels like when it is healthy and whole and mutual and safe. You have been doing your own quiet, steady work of healing and becoming. Some of that work has been intentional. Some of it has happened almost without your knowing it. Growth that has occurred simply because you kept moving forward, kept choosing yourself, kept refusing to settle for less than what your heart knows is possible. The universe has not wasted a single day of this process. Not one. Every day that felt like waiting, like standing in a doorway between what was and what is coming, was actually a day of preparation. Every day that felt like distance or uncertainty or the ache of not yet was actually the sacred space that both of you needed to become who you needed to be. So that when you come together, truly come together, you come as two whole people. Not two people looking for the other to fix what is broken inside them. Not two people bringing the same old unhealed wounds to a new version of the same old patterns. But two people who have each done the work of becoming themselves. Two whole souls who choose each other not out of need or fear or habit, but out of genuine, clear-eyed, fully awake love. That is the love that lasts. That is the love that deepens instead of dulling over time. That is the love that can hold both joy and difficulty without breaking. That is the love that becomes a home, not a place, but a feeling. The feeling of being truly known and truly chosen. And that love is close. Closer than you have allowed yourself to believe lately, perhaps. The angels are clear about this. The distance between where you are now and where you are meant to be together is shorter than it has ever been. The path is clearing. What needed to shift is shifting. What needed to be released is being released. The timing that felt so frustratingly out of your hands is quietly, invisibly aligning into something that will make sense when you can finally see the whole picture. Your soulmate is walking toward you, not with hurried, desperate, anxious steps, but with intentional and grounded and certain steps. Steps that carry the quiet confidence of someone who has done the work and trusts both themselves and the direction they are moving in. Steps that say, without needing to say it out loud, I know where I am going and I am ready for what I find there. There is a beautiful, invisible harmony being built between you both, emotionally, spiritually, energetically. A resonance that grows stronger with every day that each of you continues to choose growth. Even when you cannot see it, even when the physical distance or the circumstances or the uncertainty make it feel like nothing is moving, it is moving. The angels see the invisible threads of this connection pulling you both toward each other. They see the love between you as a living, breathing, expanding force. One that has not been diminished by the challenges it has faced but has been made deeper by them. More textured, more real, more capable of sustaining what life will bring. The destiny approaching for you both is not luck. It is not accident. It is not something that simply fell out of the sky. It is the direct and real result of transformation, of two people choosing, again and again, to face themselves and grow, of love deciding, in the quiet moments, in the hard moments, in the moments when giving up would have been easier, that it was worth it, that you were worth it, that this was worth it. Every single choice made in the direction of growth brought you both one step closer to this moment. And this moment is so very near. When it comes, and it will come, the angels are certain of this, you will recognize it. Not necessarily because of some dramatic external event, though that may come too, but because of how it feels in your body, in your chest, in the quietest part of yourself that always knows the truth even when the mind is still catching up. A kind of peace that you cannot manufacture or force. A rightness. A settling into something that has always been true but has only now found the right conditions to fully reveal itself. A knowing deep, steady, unmistakable, that this is what all the waiting and all the growing and all the trusting was leading to. Dear one, hold everything that has been shared with you today. Hold it carefully, like something precious, because that is exactly what it is. Let it be a source of genuine comfort on the days when the waiting feels heavy and the doubt is loud. Let it be a reminder, a real, tangible, returnable to reminder, when the small voice of fear tries to tell you that you were wrong to hope, that it is taking too long, that maybe you misunderstood. Let it be the steady, unflickering flame that keeps your faith alive through every season. Your soulmate is not lost to you. They are becoming, right now, in real time, through every choice they make and every step they take. The person who is truly ready to love you the way you deserve. And you are becoming, through your own journey of growth and healing and self-discovery, the person who is truly ready to receive and return that love in its fullness. These two processes are not separate. They are connected. They are part of the same great unfolding, the same sacred story. You are not alone in any of this. You have never been alone in any of this. Every step of the way, the visible steps and the invisible ones, the steps that made sense at the time and the ones that only make sense in hindsight, seen and unseen forces have been working, guiding, clearing the path, healing what needed to be healed, softening what needed to be softened, preparing the ground, tenderly and with great intention, for something truly beautiful and truly lasting to grow. The love that is coming to you has been earned. Through growth, through patience, through the quiet daily choice to keep becoming. It has been purified through difficulty, made cleaner, clearer, more genuine by everything it has survived. It has been made stronger by every obstacle it has faced rather than weakened. And it is ready. It is ready for you. It is moving toward you even as you read these words. Keep your heart open, not naively, not without discernment, but genuinely, bravely open. Keep your faith steady, not as a performance, not as forced positivity, but as the natural result of truly understanding what has been revealed to you today. Keep showing up for yourself, for your own growth and healing and becoming, the way your soulmate has been showing up for theirs. Because the love between you is not just a destination you are heading toward. It is something you are both actively building with every choice you make right now. The story you are living is not over. It is not even at its best part yet. You are standing at the edge of the most beautiful chapter, the one that all the earlier chapters, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones, were preparing you for. The one where the love that has been growing and deepening and being made ready finally gets to bloom in full. May the angels walk beside you every step of the way. May their light find you in every moment of uncertainty and remind you that you are never without guidance. May their love wrap around you in every moment of loneliness and remind you that you are never truly alone. May their presence fill the quiet spaces of your heart with a peace that goes deeper than circumstances, deeper than doubt, deeper than fear. Peace that holds. You are so deeply, completely, endlessly loved. Not just by the soulmate who is growing and moving toward you. Not just by the angels who watch over you with such care and such joy. But by the universe itself. The vast, wise, patient universe that has been orchestrating every detail of this story from the very beginning. You are known. You are cherished. You are held. And what is coming for you, what is already on its way, is more beautiful, more real, more everything than you have yet allowed yourself to fully imagine. Let yourself imagine it. Let yourself feel it. Let yourself believe in it. Because it is true. Stay in faith, dear one. Stay in love. Stay in the knowing that this story is being written by hands far wiser and more loving than fear. The angels are with you. They have always been with you. And they will be with you every step of the way. And on the days when that feels hard to hold on to, and there will be some days when it feels hard because you are human and this is real and waiting is not easy, on those days come back to this. Come back to these words. Come back to the truth that was shared here. Let it be an anchor when the waves are high. Let it be a light when the path feels dark. Let it remind you that the silence between now and what is coming is not emptiness. It is fullness. It is the quiet that exists just before something beautiful begins. You were guided here today because something in you needed to hear this, needed to be reminded, needed to feel the presence of something greater wrapping around the hope that you have been quietly protecting inside yourself, even when it felt almost too fragile to keep. That hope is not foolish. That hope is not mistaken. That hope is one of the most spiritually accurate things living inside you right now. Honor it. Protect it. Feed it with truth. The angels bless you today with renewed strength for the journey, with clarity that cuts through confusion, with patience that is not passive but alive and purposeful, with the deep, settled knowing that you are exactly where you are meant to be, not lost, not forgotten, not behind, but right on time for everything that is coming. May that knowing travel from your mind down into your heart and from your heart out into every part of how you move through your days. May it change something in you. May it make tomorrow feel different than today. May it make hope feel not like something you have to work to maintain, but like something that simply lives in you, natural, warm, and steady as breath. This is the angel's message for you today. Carry it well. You are loved beyond measure. Amen.